Welcome, everyone. My name is Izzy Fuqua. I'm the Adult Programs Coordinator for the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and I've had the delight of working with Dr. Peter Schertz, the coordinating curator of our special exhibition, Sunken Cities, these last months on a 5-part lecture series, which will conclude tonight with our speaker, Dr. Jeremy McKierney. Peter, I think I'll turn it over to you for introductions.
Okay, thank you, Lizzie. And thank all of you for coming to this, Lizzie said, our final lecture in the Sunken Cities series. The other lectures, I believe, are already online on YouTube, together with other programming that we've done. And it is one of my great pleasures in this new year to be able to introduce Professor McInerney. And one of the many things that I hold against this COVID-19 thing is that he wasn't able to come to Virginia in person, that we're not able to see each other in person, because he is an incredibly talented and creative scholar who has written on a whole variety of topics, including herding and sanctuaries in ancient Greece, and really interesting work on ethnicity in the Greek world, both on the local level in a region called Phocis, where the Temple of Delphi was located, but also more recently he edited a volume about ethnicity and antiquity. So he is thoroughly well prepared to deliver today's talk, Cleopatra's World, about the fusion of Greek and Egyptian civilization, one of the prominent themes and leitmotifs of Sunken Cities. So without further ado, let us welcome Professor McInerney.
Thank you very much, Peter. Let me begin by thanking Izzy and Peter for the very kind invitation to come and join you tonight. They actually invited me to come down and join you, but that wasn't possible. And let me thank all of you for taking the time to come to the lecture tonight. If you're at all like me, you'll probably feel somewhat zoomed out. I was teaching during the fall, preparing between 6 and 8 mini lectures every week for 15 weeks. And once I passed the 100 mark, I vowed I was going to stop counting the number of times I spoke to my screen like this. I think I've realized what awaits me in hell after I die. Namely, it's going to be an eternity of watching my own lectures. Putting that aside, I want to talk to you tonight about the culture that grew up in Egypt after the country was conquered by Alexander's forces, and particularly to talk about the very unusual culture that evolved involving Greeks and Egyptians for 300 years, basically from the time of Alexander down to the Battle of Actium. So it's going to be an interesting story and a complicated one, so bear with me as I try to tease out some threads here about the nature of the fusion of cultures. The story, as with so much in antiquity from the 4th century onwards, begins with Alexander. And if you look at this map, I just want to get you oriented for a moment. You'll see the Eastern Mediterranean. You can see Greece to the east of Italy. And to the north of that, you can see Macedon. And this is the area, obviously, from which Alexander set out shortly after his father had been assassinated. And if you look at the area marked in yellow and pale green on the map, you'll be able to follow the campaign of Alexander that took place over the next decade, from about 334 till the time of his death in 324 in Babylon. And if you compare, and this is a really important point, if you compare the sheer scale of that territory, the conquered territory, with little Greece and Macedon on the northwestern side of the map, you'll appreciate why Alexander was referred to as Alexander the Great. He conquered a vast amount of territory, Turkey, Syria, Israel, of course I'm using the modern names for these territories, the Gaza Strip, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and all of those Central Asian republics in the far northeastern side of the map from northern Afghanistan upwards. So this is a vast undertaking, a huge area. And at the time of Alexander's death, he hadn't really had time to rule this empire. He was simply in a 10-year campaign of conquest. At the time of his death, the empire fell into a full generation of war between Alexander's successors. They're called the Diadokoi, often by Greek historians, the successors of Alexander. And as you can see in this map of the Hellenistic world, the world created by Alexander, over the course of the 30 years after his death, the whole of that empire broke into a series of states and kingdoms controlled by the men who had been the officers of Alexander's army. The most notable of these is the territory of Egypt, which was taken over by a man by the name of Ptolemy, who had been one of Alexander's bodyguards. Now, that term means something slightly different in the original Greek in relation to the Macedonian army. These are the men who were Alexander's inner circle, his best friends, his compatriots. And so being a bodyguard of Alexander actually means he was part of the inner circle. And if you look at the various states of the Eastern Mediterranean, what you find about Egypt that marks it out as being different from virtually all of the others is that Egypt is a highly self-contained unit. And Ptolemy, I think, understood this and very wisely decided to grab this in the breakup of Alexander's empire. If you look here, you'll see that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. That's obvious. To the east, there's a desert. To the west, there's a desert. To the south, there are cataracts. And to the north, there is this massive delta taking the Nile through its 7 mouths out to the Mediterranean. And so of all of the territories conquered by Alexander, this was the one that proved to be the richest and the most stable for the next 300 years. And this dynasty of the Ptolemies ruled successfully here for the next 300 years. Here's another map showing you Ptolemaic Egypt. And you'll notice on this map that if you look at the Nile and you see places like Thebes in the south and Memphis in the north, you'll notice that the old traditional Egyptian capitals are located on the river, but that Alexandria, the new city founded by Alexander, is actually located to the west of the delta, on the very edge of Egyptian territory as defined by the Nile River. And in fact, when the Romans referred to Alexandria, they called it Alexandria next to Egypt. A friend of mine, a very prominent Roman historian, once pointed out that most of the cities built by the Hellenistic rulers, the men who came after Alexander, were built very close to water and often close to the Mediterranean coast, almost as if they couldn't believe that they really were going to continue in control of these empires, and at any moment they might have to get up and sail away back to Macedon. So the position of Alexandria already signals to us that there's something a little unusual about the relationship between the Greco-Macedonian conquerors and the Egyptians they conquered. And in particular, in Egypt, as opposed to all the other areas of Alexander's conquests, what's really particular and unusual is that, of course, these conquerors were not conquering no man's land or empty territory. Unlike the Europeans who came to North America or to Australia for that matter, or parts of Africa in the 19th century, in the great breakup of territories acquired by the European powers in the age of colonialism, when the Greeks came to Egypt, they were encountering a land that was already ancient. The Egyptians had already developed an ancient civilization, by this stage 3,500 years old, with undeniable and extremely visible accomplishments, such as the pyramids that you see before you. And what happens in the Greek encounter with this and their meeting with the Egyptians is that they really develop a kind of schizophrenic response. What I mean by that is that in relation to the outside world, the world of the Mediterranean, the Ptolemies and the Greeks of Egypt behave as if they are still Greek. If you look at the coins, for example, which were used by the Ptolemies to pay for their international trade, you'll see on the left-hand side a coin that shows the head of Zeus, a coin in the center that says that it is a coin of King Ptolemy that has a Greek eagle on it. On the top right-hand side, a coin of Ptolemy that shows him in profile. Same at the bottom, where again we've got Ptolemy, and again the eagle that seems to represent Zeus. And Ptolemy is clean shaven, emulating in profile the coins of Alexander. So these gold and silver coins, which were the medium of exchange for the trade between Egypt and the larger Mediterranean world, was done with symbols and emblems that marked the Ptolemies as Greek. If these coins turned up on Cyprus or in Rhodes, where goods were being exchanged, the message they told you was Ptolemy is a Greek and he's part of the Greek world. But in Egypt, where the Ptolemies ruled and where their audience was the local people, the Egyptians, they ruled as if they were pharaohs, and they presented themselves as if they were pharaohs, such as in this diorite bust of Ptolemy that shows him wearing the royal headdress of an Egyptian pharaoh. So I want you to keep this in mind. This is very important. On the one hand, you've got the Ptolemies as Greeks facing out and as Egyptians facing in. For the first 30 years, in fact, Ptolemy didn't even rule as a king. He ruled as if he were the provincial governor, although Alexander was dead. But Alexander cast such a great shadow that for 30 years, none of his successors would actually claim the title king. And when Ptolemy was defeated in a naval battle of Cyprus in 306 BC, he found out that the winners, Antigonus and Demetrius, had been hailed as king by their troops. And according to Plutarch, the Egyptians, when they were apprised of this circumstance, gave Ptolemy likewise the title of king, that they might not appear to be dispirited with their late defeat. That's an extraordinary story. The Ptolemies become kings of Egypt because their soldiers don't want them to be depressed about the fact that they've lost a battle. That's the story. But already in Egypt, not to a Greek audience and not facing out, but in Egypt, the Ptolemies are putting themselves on the sides of temples, as you see here, in the guise of Egyptian pharaohs. So they're really sending different messages depending upon the audience that they're talking to. So when, for example, the Ptolemies, not the pharaohs, but the Ptolemies, the Greek rulers, build this temple to Isis on the island of Philae, the temple they build looks entirely Egyptian. You'd be hard pressed to find any Greek elements in this temple. This does not look like the Parthenon. It certainly doesn't look like anything you'll ever see in Macedon. But here, the Ptolemies are trying to make themselves acceptable to their Egyptian audience by building in styles that evoke the great past of Egypt and make them out to be continuators of Egyptian culture. Nowhere is this schizophrenia or ambiguity, whatever you want to call it, more clearly evoked than in the imagery of these Hellenistic queens, probably Cleopatra. On the left, you see a gold coin, again designed for export and external trade, showing her in the guise of a Greek matron. Moderately dressed, you can see the shawl on her shoulders, her hair carefully coiffed and pulled back in Greek style, shown in profile like the other members of her dynasty. That's Cleopatra as a Greek. But on the right, you'll see a statue that actually blends this Hellenistic queen with an Egyptian goddess, Isis, carrying the Ankh in her right hand and a cornucopia in her left arm, naked in a way that no Greek woman would ever be displayed, except perhaps the goddess Aphrodite. So these Ptolemies are very adept at sending mixed messages, or if you like, clear messages to different audiences, to the Greeks and to the Egyptians. The question this raises is, if we go behind the images, what is the nature of this rule and this culture in Ptolemaic Egypt? Well, I mentioned that Egypt is the gift of the Nile, and for thousands of years, the land inundated by the Nile has been worked by Egyptian peasants, controlled by a state apparatus that reaches the tip of the pyramid in the pharaoh. The Ptolemies took this over, clearly understanding that this was a state that could be controlled centrally with a massive bureaucracy. Ptolemy II wrote a series of revenue laws, and I want to show you some of the things that he wrote to his junior bureaucrats. In your tours of inspection, try and going from place to place to cheer everybody up and put them in better heart. And not only should you do this by words, but also if any of them complain of the secretary, the commagrammateus, or the comarch, the mayor, about any matter touching agricultural work, you should make inquiry and put a stop to such doings as far as possible. So we've got a centralized bureaucracy controlling the agriculturally rich resources of Egypt. And we've got other documents that also spell out exactly how this centralized economic administration worked. All cattle had to be registered, especially during the wet season. There were precise regulations for how you got the goods from all the villages along the Nile down to Alexandria. And I want to read you just one stipulation. If any of you do any weaving or any knitting, imagine receiving a note from the mayor of your town or of your suburb saying, let all the looms which are idle be transported to the metropolis of the region, deposited in the storehouse and sealed up. That's the equivalent of the mayor sending you a letter saying, you can knit this amount, and when you finish knitting, please return the knitting needles to the mayor's office. Everything was meant to be controlled. Prices, inspections, there were audits, the number of trees that could be planted, the number of calves that could be bred, all of these are spelled out. And what you end up with is a massive bureaucracy. I've really seen nothing like it, except perhaps in Soviet Russia, hence the picture on the right. Now, I'm not going to read you this long document. You can read it at your own leisure if you choose. But what I've given you here are 4 letters that are all part of a single dossier. And what they are the letters that go from junior officials in the villages up to their regional masters and then on to their Alexandrian central master and back down again. This is pure bureaucracy. You write to the boss saying, what am I to do about X? He writes to his boss who says, what am I to do about X? Until instructions then filter down, basically telling you what you're meant to do. Now, when I read this, I often think of calling AT&T or, God forbid, the IRS and trying to get through to a human being to get precise instructions. This is a pure bureaucracy because all information is being pushed up and down with instructions eventually for how the peasants are to behave. And it is cloaked in such ambiguity as to make clarity an impossibility. What's clear is the system is really based on coercion. We get a number of documents that have these complaints, and this is really fascinating. Take a look at this. To Xenon, greetings. I carried out the instructions in connection with the camels, but when I requested the salary you had ordered, Krotos gave me nothing. I'm in distress summer and winter. Please order them to pay what is owed to me so that I don't die of hunger because I don't know how to speak Greek. Now, the irony of this is this letter was written in Greek. It's written in Greek because the only way to get your complaint heard was to hire a Greek translator who would take your Egyptian complaint and put it into an official petition written in Greek. We have dozens of these. We've got one where the fellows say, my team and I deposited our tools which were used for cutting stone, and when we went back to take them out the next time, we were given soft tools instead of hard tools, and now we can't do our work. Please look into it. In another instance, a fellow complains about a physical assault and says, I've been assaulted, but I can't get any justice from the local police officer because I don't speak Greek. And again, the petition is written in Greek because he had to go to the local translator to help him with this. So it's an extraordinarily coercive system. And it's proof of the fact, I think, and this is important to recognize, that the Greeks were not actually popular in Egypt at all. The best evidence for this comes from a really interesting series of documents that will surprise you. If you've ever read the Apocalypse of St. John and you're familiar with Jewish traditions about apocryphal literature, that texts that forecast the end of the world, you may be surprised to find out that the Egyptians also produced texts like this, texts that foretold the end of days. Of course, as with everything else in Egypt, it begins with the river. The river will flow without enough water, with insufficient, so the land will be inflamed, And it'll be the Typhonians, which is the way the Greeks are referred to in these texts, who will say, "Wretched Egypt, you're wronged by terrible iniquities wrought against you. The sun will be darkened, not wishing to look upon the evil things in Egypt. The land will not welcome the sowing of the seeds." And if you skip down, you'll see below, "In this generation there'll be war and murder, which will destroy brothers and husbands and wives. For these things will come to pass when the great god Hephaestus wishes to return to the city, and the belt wearers," probably referring to sword belts worn by the Greeks, "will destroy themselves. Evil will be wrought." Now, these apocryphal texts that forecast the apocalypse are really about the end of Greek control of Egypt. And they correspond to actual historical events because around 200, for about 20 years, Egypt was racked by unrest led by two Egyptian pretenders to the throne who sought to throw the Greeks out and to win Egypt back for the Egyptians. They were ultimately unsuccessful, but it shows you what a fine and delicate balancing act it was for the Greeks to maintain their control of Egypt. One of the ways that they tried to do this was by impressing upon the Egyptians just how magnificent their culture was and their religion. And they did so in particular in events like the Grand Procession sponsored by Ptolemy Philadelphus. And I just want to read you some of the description here of the procession. Obviously, I can't show you photographs of the procession of Ptolemy Philadelphus. So instead, I show you a huge, colorful, exuberant Hindu procession in honor of Ganesh, which is very similar in spirit and intensity to the Greek celebrations being held in Alexandria. First of all, there went the procession of Lucifer, that actually refers to the morning star, Venus, for the festival began at the time when that star first appears. Then came processions in honor of the several gods. In the Dionysus procession, first of all, there went Silene to keep off the multitude, some clad in purple cloaks, some in scarlet ones. These are followed by satyrs bearing gilded lamps made of ivory wood. And after them came images of victory having golden wings, and they bore in their hands incense burners, 6 cubits in height, adorned with branches made of ivory wood and gold, and clad in tunics embroidered with figures of animals. And they themselves also had a great deal of gold ornament about them. After them followed an altar 6 cubits high, a double altar, all covered with gilded ivy leaves, having a crown of vine leaves upon it, all in gold. This is, if you will, conspicuous consumption that is all done in order to impress the local population with the magnificence of the power of Ptolemy. And you can imagine young boys, for example, being besotted by the color and the sound and the smell of these magnificent celebrations, like these boys at a Hindu festival in London. And just like them, the description of the procession in Alexandria says, "Next came boys in purple tunics bearing frankincense and myrrh and saffron on golden dishes. And then advanced 40 satyrs crowned with golden ivy garlands. Their bodies were painted, some with purple, some with vermilion, and some with other colors. They each wore a golden crown made to imitate vine leaves and ivy leaves, excuse me." So the Ptolemies didn't spare any expense when it came to impressing the people of Alexandria, and particularly their Egyptian population, of the magnificence and the power and the wealth of their rule. And they also tried to win over the local populations by continuing the worship of the Apis bull, an older Egyptian cult, which they continued to honor, even mummifying the remains of these Apis bulls as a sign of their great piety towards the Egyptian gods, and then burying these in these magnificent underground sanctuaries, the Serapeums of Alexandria, and in this case of Memphis. And this points to the fact that one of the ways that the Ptolemies tried to make their power acceptable to the Egyptians was by cooperating with the local priests. It was the priestly class that largely helped the Ptolemies to continue to rule, even though they were perceived as foreigners. The Ptolemies clearly thought that religion was the way to sell Greek culture to the Egyptians, and in particular, to try to create a kind of fusion or a hybrid of Greek and Egyptian culture and religion. One of the later commentators about this, a man by the name of Macrobius, says, in the city on the borders of Egypt, which boasts Alexander of Macedon as its founder, Alexandria, Serapis and Isis are worshipped with a reverence that is almost fanatical. Evidence that the sun, under the name of Serapis, is the object of all this reverence is the basket set on the head of the god. That's interesting, but if you look at a head of Serapis, like the one I'm showing you on the left, and it has the basket on his head, I think you'll agree that there's not very much about this iconography or this imagery that looks Egyptian. That looks like the head of Zeus. What we're finding is that Serapis is, in fact, a hybrid god who is meant to appeal to the Egyptians because he has elements of the Apis cult connected to him, and to appeal to the Greeks because he has elements of the Zeus cult attached to him. And similarly, Isis was often worshipped, but referred to as if she was known by different names, such as the name of Athena. They even, in some instances, once the Romans are on the scene, refer to her as Minerva. And one of her epithets is the star of the sea that guides sailors, an epithet that was certainly taken up later on by Christians. Many of you will be familiar with Mary being known as Stella Maris, the star of the sea. So this is a culture which is trying to develop a kind of ambiguity or a fusion that breaks down barriers. And that's why you end up with figures like this, which you will have seen in the exhibition, that represent both a Hellenistic queen and also the goddess Isis. They're really trying to present the Ptolemaic dynasty as a fusion of Greek and Egyptian elements, but particularly Egyptian elements for the Egyptians, not for foreign or international consumption, but certainly for domestic consumption. Now, one place where this fusion culture is most prominent, and this is a really fascinating one, is in the Library of Alexandria. Now, we're used to thinking of this as being a repository of Greek culture. We think of the thousands of texts that were destroyed when the library burnt down. But what people often don't recognize is that it wasn't just Greek texts that were stored in these shelves, these bibliothecae, as they're called. These are the cupboards that show where the scrolls of various texts were kept. And we're used to the idea this is primarily Greek, but that's not the case. The Ptolemies actually wanted the secret knowledge and the holy books of other cultures, not only Greek, but for example, also Jewish, to be translated and brought here for their perusal and for their storage. Now, we think of this as being primarily a Greek cultural product because when we find the papyri from this period, they have Greek texts on them. This is a text of Euclid, the mathematician, and you can see on the left-hand side at the bottom of the writing there the term tetragonon, which means square, with a small diagram meant to help the student as he learns what the properties of a square may be. But there's another aspect to the library which is really fascinating. About 20 years ago, an Italian scholar by the name of Luciano Canfora took the ground plan of the funerary temple, the mortuary temple of Ramses, the so-called Ramesseum, and demonstrated that it corresponds very closely to the literary descriptions we have of the layout of the Library of Alexandria. He pointed out that just as the Ramesseum had the Book of the Dead and other various Egyptian holy texts, so too the Library of Alexandria had holy texts as well, wisdom literature from the Greeks and from the Egyptians and from the Jews. And just as that was deployed in the case of the Ramesseum to surround the center, which was the body of Ramses, so too the Library of Alexandria was built with the body of Alexander at its center. So we seem to have the possibility, the really interesting possibility, that the library represents a kind of merging, if you will, of Egyptian practice and Greek practice in dialogue with each other. This is quite different, of course, from any kind of official iconography, but it suggests the reality of a kind of fusion culture beginning to take shape in Egypt under the Ptolemies. So far, I've been telling you a story that's complicated because it has some elements that are defiantly Greek, some elements that are defiantly Egyptian, some elements that involve a kind of fusion of the two. But we have to take into consideration in the last part of the lecture an historical element, and that is that the history of Ptolemaic Egypt coincides with a period of growth to power of the Roman Republic. If you look at this map, I'm showing you primarily a Hellenistic Greek world, a post-Alexander world, but ominously on the far western side, on the left-hand side of the map, you'll see that there is a Roman Republic, a Roman boot looming over the Eastern Mediterranean. And it is really about to kick butt all over the Eastern Mediterranean. For 200 years, the Roman Republic grew until it controlled all of the Western Mediterranean. By 146, it had destroyed Carthage and taken over the entire Western Mediterranean. And gradually, as it turned its eyes to the east, it came in more and more contact with the various eastern states that you can see on the map before you, maintaining relatively friendly relations with Egypt, for example. But the turning point for the history of Ptolemaic Egypt and Rome comes in the middle of the 1st century BC. And briefly to recap, the story is that at this point, the Roman Republic had not only acquired vast amounts of territory, but had acquired vastly powerful generals. The most powerful of these were Pompey in the east and Caesar in the west. Pompey, in fact, through warfare and diplomacy, had totally redrawn the map of the Eastern Mediterranean and returned successfully after a 3-year campaign to Rome in 63 BC and asked the Senate to ratify his arrangements for the East, the so-called Eastern Acta. The Senate refused, and Pompey was pushed into the arms of Caesar, with whom he made an alliance that lasted for close to 20 years. However, the Senate, fearing the power of these two generals, eventually seduced Pompey over to their side. And when Caesar marched into the Italian peninsula in 49, crossing the Rubicon, Pompey, representing the senatorial side, fled to Greece. In 48 BC, Pompey was defeated by the army of Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus, and he fled then to Alexandria in Egypt. And this map shows you on the bottom right-hand side, Caesar following Pompey to the kingdom of the Ptolemies and to Alexandria in 48 BC. Before I take you any further into the details of this, I have to tell you that when Pompey got to Alexandria, he was greeted by Ptolemy XIII, who was the brother of Cleopatra. And now she's going to enter our story decisively. We're not just going to be talking about the world of Cleopatra, but we're going to talk about Cleopatra herself. And so I want to digress for a moment. So just bear with me, would you? Because people have a lot of questions about Cleopatra. We'll come back to more of these in the Q&A, but I want to set this up a little bit by telling you some of the things that we do know about her. First of all, on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see an extended family tree going all the way back up to the top to Ptolemy I, and he was the son of Lagus and Arsinoe. And you'll see, and I want to make this point emphatically, that throughout the many generations of the Ptolemies, and the term Ptolemy was originally a name, but later became a title, the Ptolemies tended to intermarry, and one finds the same names occurring amongst both the men and the women. All the men, for the most part, being known as Ptolemy, and the women, for the most part, being either called Arsinoe, Berenike, or Cleopatra. So this is a closed dynasty, and that's an important point. Cleopatra carries a name that, in fact, is a perfectly standard Greek name that means the glory of the father, Cleopatra. Some of you will have read the Iliad and you'll be familiar with Patroclus. His name is exactly the same name, but with the elements inverted, the glory of the father. So her name is Greek, and the form Cleopatra is attested as early as Homer. It was a very popular Macedonian name, so it's not unusual to see it turning up in a Macedonian dynasty. And as you can see from the plan I've shown you, they're a dynasty that favor intermarriage, and so the bloodline is kept, in their eyes, pure. Now, the depictions of her present her either as Macedonian, and that we've seen in some coins and some busts, or they present her as Egyptian, which is where she's often presented as if she were the goddess Isis. But this shouldn't be taken as any kind of realistic depiction of her or representation of her. It is very much designed as a part of the royal propaganda of the Ptolemies that they were like the Egyptian gods come to life. And I will point out, and we can discuss this further on later on, but no Greek or Roman source either depicts her or describes her as African. And so even though the issue of Cleopatra being a Black African is, I know, a fraught issue that many people fight over, from the historian's point of view, this is largely a question about modern debates about ethnic identity and has very little to do with the actual historical record. We'll come to more of that probably during the Q&A. So I'm suggesting then that the Cleopatra that was in Egypt was a Macedonian Greek. That does not mean that I want to subscribe to the Hollywood view of Cleopatra, where she's a femme fatale, here shown as portrayed by Elizabeth Taylor. We have one passage that describes her physical appearance. So I think we should take a look at that. Plutarch tells us, for her beauty, as we're told, was in itself not altogether incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her, but conversation with her had an irresistible charm, and her presence combined with the persuasiveness of her discourse and the character which was somehow diffused about her behavior towards others had something stimulating about it. There was sweetness also in the tones of her voice, and her tongue, like an instrument of many strings, she could readily turn to whatever language she pleased. Now, these are not the descriptions of a Hollywood beauty, but they are the descriptions of an extraordinarily accomplished and successful young woman. At Alexandria in 48 BC, the situation that existed at the time of Pompey's arrival was that shortly before, in a palace coup, 3 high-ranking officials named Theodotus, Pothinus, and Achalas had expelled Cleopatra in favor of her brother, Ptolemy XIII. On August the 10th of that year, Julius Caesar's forces defeated the pro-republican forces of Pompey at Pharsalus. And in September, Pompey arrived at Alexandria, where he was immediately beheaded on the orders of Ptolemy XIII's regents. Only a few days later, Caesar, in hot pursuit, arrived, and furious at what had befallen Pompey, his one-time rival and one-time friend, he deposed Ptolemy XIII and restored Cleopatra. So we find Cleopatra, a young woman, vulnerable, expelled from the throne at one point, now brought back thanks to the protection of a highly successful Roman general and much older man, Julius Caesar. The Alexandrian populace, however, was infuriated by the arrival of these Romans, and they actually besieged Caesar inside the palace of Cleopatra. And over that winter, the Alexandrian War took place, which was a series of street battles between Caesar's forces and those of the Egyptians. By the end of March, the Alexandrian War had come to an end. Ptolemy XIII had fled and was drowned in the Nile, and this left Cleopatra the sole ruler of Egypt. And during this period, Caesar and Cleopatra had an affair that led to the birth of Ptolemy, Ptolemy Caesar, there blending the two names, also known as Caesarion, Little Caesar, who was acknowledged as the son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. Now, Caesar then returned to Rome in order to celebrate a triumph, the capstone of a Roman general's career. And Arsinoe, the sister of Cleopatra, was among the captives who were marched in chains in that triumph. But Cleopatra's special relationship with Caesar meant that she was allowed to live with Caesar in Rome. No one was going to challenge his decision. And in fact, Caesar showed great favor towards her by placing a statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix. At the time, Cleopatra was protected by Caesar. but she was despised by a great many people who saw her as an interloper. Caesar was a married Roman citizen. This was a woman who was a foreigner and from a state that had been under the protection of the Romans and should have been comporting herself in their eyes as if she were a subordinate rather than an equal of Caesar. Cicero, for example, couldn't stand her and said the Queen's insolence too when she was living in Caesar's Transtiberine villa, I cannot recall without a pang. I won't have anything to do with that lot. Well, he didn't need to have much to do with Caesar or Cleopatra because in 44 Caesar was assassinated and Cleopatra very wisely immediately withdrew from Rome and went straight back to Alexandria. And it's at this point that we get to the last phase of both Egyptian independence and also the story of Cleopatra and Rome. This is an episode in the story that you'll be familiar with to some extent because it involves the man whose coin you see on the left, Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony. And I'm betting that you're expecting me to say that Hollywood version of Mark Antony being besotted by Cleopatra, the whole Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor thing, that's all a fiction, it's all made up, it's all nonsense. I'm not going to say that at all. I actually think the film gets it spot on. Mark Antony was besotted by Cleopatra. He ignored his Roman wife, and like Caesar before him, whose legacy he was attempting to control, Mark Antony made his way to Egypt, fell in love with Cleopatra, married her, and had at least 3 children by her, who were princelings, nominally put in charge of various regions of North Africa. What was the basis of this? Like Caesar and Cleopatra, there was a difference in age. We've seen that Cleopatra, by all accounts, was not a femme fatale or a stunning beauty. In the case of Antony, I think, though, the attraction is easy to explain. Antony was a man of powerful appetites. He drank vast amounts. His cook once said that he had to keep 12 different wild boar in the oven at different stages of the day, so that no matter what time Mark Antony came to table, there was a wild boar waiting for him to chow down on with his friends. He loved to feast, he loved to drink, he loved to indulge himself. Cleopatra was exactly the same way. They actually formed a group of courtiers and followers with them who are known as the high livers, the people who like to live high, who like to drink hard and play hard. When Cleopatra took Mark Antony for a cruise on the Nile, she had a ship built with so many banks of oars that it would not have even survived in the open sea, almost impossible to row. But it was a massive indulgence by which she could impress him. She also paid for the campaigns that he then went on to fight in the early 30s against Rome's enemies in the east, the Parthians. But during this whole time, even though they had children together and it looked as if a great Roman general and a Hellenistic princess were beginning to forge the possibility of a Hellenistic world that would actually take over Rome rather than vice versa, even during all this period, there was one other figure looming on the historical stage, and that was Gnaeus Octavius, the adopted son, actually the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, known to most of us as Octavian and later on known as Augustus. And it was he marshalling many of the legions left by Caesar who ended up fighting Mark Antony in the last stages of the Roman Civil War that actually engulfed all of the Mediterranean. And the capstone battle of that confrontation was the battle that took place at Actium, just off the coast of Western Greece in 31 BC, involving the fleet of Octavian, that is to say Augustus, on one side, and the combined fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra on the other. The details of the battle are very hard to piece together, but it actually seems as if there was a miscommunication between Antony and Cleopatra's fleets, And Cleopatra's fleet actually left the battle before there'd been any serious engagement, certainly before her forces had been defeated. It may have been that there was a signal mishap. We don't really know. But her forces left. Mark Antony took off after her. And so the field, or the naval field, if you will, was left to Augustus, to Octavian, who became Augustus shortly after. The miscommunications continued in the aftermath. The two navies of Antony and Cleopatra fled separately. And at one point, Antony received news that Cleopatra had died or committed suicide. It was false. She had not, but he himself took his own life. And then when Cleopatra found out that Mark Antony was dead, she famously, as you know, clasped an asp to her bosom and died as well. Moving away from the romance of this and the tragedy of this, what we've got here is a kind of fulcrum moment, a moment when we get to ask what sort of legacy the ancient world was going to leave. You see, had Mark Antony, who was sometimes referred to as the last Hellenistic prince, succeeded at Actium, what would have been forged would have been a combination of Roman military might and the Greek Macedonian culture located in Alexandria. Instead of Rome becoming the Mediterranean capital that it was to be then and for hundreds of years after, Alexandria would have been. And the shape of not only the Eastern Mediterranean, but the entire Mediterranean, and certainly the history of North Africa and the history of Europe, would have been dramatically different. We would have recognized Alexander, shown here on this coin, as the progenitor of all of our culture and our political systems. Instead, we inherited a European world from Augustus, and it was the provinces of the Roman Empire which would go on to become the nations of Western Europe. Latin rather than Greek as the basic cultural set point for European culture. So the man on the right is the man who eventually won the day, Augustus. The man on the left, Alexander, is the man who, for my money, created a more interesting culture. And it was certainly from his side of the street that Cleopatra came. So what I've got for you then is a world of Cleopatra that is a world of contradictions, of tensions, in some cases of fusion, and in other cases of almost schizophrenia. But finally, an interesting story of the Hellenistic world of Cleopatra.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Izzy.
And as you suggested, there are follow-up questions about Cleopatra. So I thought we'd start there, since that's where your story led us, and then we can work backwards, because there were questions about the Ptolemies and hieroglyphs, and we can work backwards. But you had mentioned that Cleopatra killed herself famously by clutching a asp to her bosom, correct?
Yep.
And so the story goes that the snake then bit her, poisoning her, correct?
Yep.
Great. And then do you know, so you made very clear that Antony was in fact besotted by Cleopatra.
Yes.
What about Cleopatra with Antony?
It's an interesting question. And I should preface the answer by saying it's really dangerous to psychoanalyze people who lived 2,500 years ago. Or 2,000 years ago. And so I'm going out on a limb when I say that Antony was besotted with her, but all we can do is go by behavior and by accounts of how they behaved. So I am struck by the fact that that Antony in many respects was a kind of brutal character. And not a handsome man. I mean, his coins, boy, you know, he looks like a thug, and he behaved that way as well. He was not in the mold of Julius Caesar, that's for sure. So I am convinced that he not only recognized that Egypt was a wealthy country and that he could finance his campaigns from there, but he seems genuinely to have enjoyed his life with her. As for Cleopatra, what can one say? She had an extraordinarily difficult teenage years. when kicked off the throne, had found that the dynastic politics put her in a very weak position. And she seems to have really clung to the protection of these older men. Whether her use of sexual allure was a ploy or whether she was genuinely drawn to them, I honestly can't say. But I guess the romantic in me wants to think that she liked Antony because he was a gruff, direct, soldierly type of man, and that seems to have appealed to her.
Yeah.
I mean, she supported him through thick and thin. His campaigns were not always successful. His Parthian campaign was not a success, but she stayed with him. It may well be that looking out at the Mediterranean, her calculation was it's either Mark Antony or else Octavian, Augustus. And Octavian was not anyone's first choice for pinup boy. So it may have been a political calculation entirely, but it's really hard to pinpoint that.
Okay, great, thank you. So we were going to jump back a little bit. We have a couple of questions about language and writing. So what was the knowledge of hieroglyphs during the reign of the Ptolemies? What did they understand?
That's a very, 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 very good question. I didn't emphasize terribly much in the lecture, but it's become increasingly clear that the only way that the Ptolemies were able to remain in control of Egypt, even with its instability, was when they got the cooperation of the priestly class that controlled the major sanctuaries of Egypt. And in fact, the Rosetta Stone, which is, the document that allows us to read hieroglyphs, because we have a text that's in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and in Greek, so we can read one of those texts and use it to get to the others. That is, in fact, a text that records a series of concessions made by one of the later Ptolemies to the priestly class. So it seems as if, but to answer your question in a little bit more detail, some of the highest ranking Egyptian priests learnt Greek really quickly. And this is a fascinating phenomenon. In both Egypt and in Babylon, we have documents that are essentially histories of Egypt and Babylon, written by high priests of those respective cultures, but written in Greek. Mm-hmm. The Egyptian version is by a man called Manetho. The Greek version, the Babylonian text is by a man called Berosus. And in fact, the fact that we refer to such and such a dynasty, that whole terminology and chronology originates with Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest trying to explain Egypt to the Ptolemies. And I think Berosus was doing the same thing in relation to Babylonian religion and the Seleucids. So it's the priestly classes that basically acted as a conduit or a bridge between this Greek culture and the local culture. And I have to say, I suspect it was necessary for them to do it because the Greeks do not show a great deal of interest in foreign languages and the cultures of foreigners. So the attempt to make hieroglyphics comprehensible to Greeks probably came from Egyptian priests.
Interesting. So that kind of dovetails to a couple of questions here that I'll try and bring together. Someone's asking how were the Greeks able to rule and control Egypt for so long?
Right.
But someone else asked, after the Romans took control, did Greek continue as the main language in Egypt? And I think what we're trying to get at here is that Greece made no efforts to adopt that language, to understand it. So I was wondering if you could speak to those concepts.
Yes, it's very interesting to think. Usually I avoid comparisons with the modern world because they get a bit confusing. But if you think about the way the English took over India and the way that English became a common language throughout the whole of that region, and the way that young Indians who wanted to move up basically had to learn English and become conversant in it. I think a similar situation arises in Egypt in that Greek becomes the language of the masters. And what's interesting is that first under the Greeks with Greek, and then under the Romans with Latin, we actually get quite a few examples of people that have bilingual names.
Oh.
And this is very fascinating. This is particularly true in the army. So if you're a kid from a village on the banks of the Nile in Egypt, and you have some ambition to get out, you don't want to be a peasant working, on that land for the rest of your life. One of the few ways that you can get up and out in Ptolemaic Egypt is to join the army. And we have letters from and to many of these men, and it will say let me see if I can think of it, to Menafer, also known as Dionysius. And so he's got an Egyptian name and he's got a Greek name. And I'll guarantee that when his commanding officer was talking to him, he was Dionysius, the Greek. But when he was writing back to mum and dad and saying, could you please send me some more woolen socks, he was writing as Wenifer. The same thing happens in the Roman period, when what happens is the language of control, the language of law, the language of administration is Latin. I mean, a Roman governor is not going to be speaking Egyptian. That's the language of the conquered. And so he's going to issue his edicta in Latin, and eventually these will filter down to the villages where some poor sod who had to learn Latin will now translate it into Egyptian for the locals. So language is very much a marker of the dominance, first the Greeks and then of the Romans. As to the mechanism for their control, the army is a big part of it. The army is a very big part of it. There is a very big military presence throughout Egypt. And one of the ways that we know this is because in the Western Desert, in the northern part of the Western Desert, just before you would reach the Delta, there is a depression known as the Fayum. And that is an area that was extensively reclaimed under the Ptolemies. Irrigation canals and irrigation works were put in so that literally hundreds of square miles were brought under cultivation that hadn't been prior to this. The crops that were planted there were all basically Greek imports. It was things like olive and grape. These are Greek Mediterranean crops. They flourished in the area, but most of the land was allocated to former military officers with Greek names. So, you could come to Egypt as a mercenary from Thessaly or from Corinth or from Athens, even in old Greece. You could take Ptolemy's coin, the same as, the Irish used to take King George's penny or King George's shilling and join the British army. You could go to Egypt, join the army, and at the end of your service, if you had served well, you might be rewarded with a land grant of 50 or 100 or 200 acres of land in this really rich territory. So it was very much a military occupied territory, and one where the army served as a really interesting institution for integrating Egyptians into a Greek power structure.
That was wonderful.
It's really fascinating, yeah. There's a great book on this by a friend of mine from UCLA, Christelle Fisher-Beauvais, and she doesn't draw the comparisons, but reading it really made me think about the role of the army in the United States, where, for example, integration took place before it took place in the wider population. I think something similar may be going on in Egypt.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there have been requests for additional reading suggestions, and we aren't going to be able to get to everyone's questions. It is 7:30 right now, but maybe I'll pick your brain a little bit and send out a really nice follow-up email to everybody, answering a couple of questions, some suggested further reading materials.
Sure.
And one person mentioned that in your introduction, you commented on your work in diversity in the ancient world. I was wondering if you could just speak briefly about that. We'd love to go out on that note as it relates to a program that we just hosted this earlier in the week.
It's hard to sort of sum that up in a sentence. I edited a volume that had something like 40 chapters in it about ethnicity in the ancient Mediterranean. So that's all over the map. But I guess what I'd get to as a sort of a final statement is this. Be very careful when you're thinking about ethnicity that you're not just doing what we used to do with race, but replacing it with a new label. A lot of the stuff that's written about ethnicity is really racial studies, but decanted into a new bottle, but it's the same old wine. In fact, I think now in areas of identity studies, the most important thing to recognize is how fluid these are. That there isn't one identity that you have. You play different identities as you play different roles in your life. Let me give you an illustration. I taught a class on this a couple of years ago, and all of the students in the class were Americans, obviously, as you might expect. And when I talked to them about what's the identity that you feel most strongly, I was really struck that there were two people in the class from Maryland, and they said, "Oh, I'm a Marylander." That was really powerful. Some people think that there is a sort of an identity in the Northwest of the US, Oregon, Washington State, Northern California, the South, the Midwest. These are identities that play out in relation to the other Americans that you may be dealing with, whether you're a Midwesterner and that's a New Yorker, or you're a Southerner and he's from California. But if you've traveled overseas and you've been talking to people from Switzerland or England or Italy, usually in those contexts, you're not a Marylander or a Southerner or a New Yorker, you're an American. So the identities that we have shift and change, and they often, not entirely, but they often depend very much on the audience that you're speaking to and who you're relating to, not what you are in your heart. A lot of the studies that I did in African studies, because I wanted comparisons for the Greek world that were a little bit more neutral, pointed out that there are people who, in some contexts, are Maasai, people of cattle. But in other contexts, what they emphasize is the tribe or the moiety or the clan within that that's of most importance to them. The language group they belong to, the guilds they belong to, their sexual identity. Are they gay? Are they straight? Are they intersectional? These are all different aspects of identity that we put on in different circumstances. So I guess if I had to sum it up, I'd say identity tends to be contingent, and that ethnic identity is very much like that as well.
Yeah, and I can see why that's difficult to boil down in a sentence. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. This was such a wonderful way to end this lecture series. And so, Peter, with that, I'll turn it over to you if you'd like to say anything.
I would just like to thank Jeremy. That was a wonderful, inspiring lecture. I wish we could go out for a drink and talk about Augustus playing the part of Apollo at the Party of the 12 Gods, and of Josephus, who basically does the same thing of trying to explain the Jews to a Greek and Roman audience. So exactly what Manetho did, and Josephus was also a priest.
Yeah.
So there was just so much to think about in that lecture. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm pleased.
And I'd like to thank our audience for coming and for supporting us throughout all of our programming during Sunken Cities. I think we were incredibly lucky to have the speakers we've had. And the fact that it was online allowed many people to join who perhaps couldn't have made it into the museum for the lecture. So silver lining at least, but I still resent the virus for not letting us do this in person.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much and have a wonderful night.